Oh, hello there, listener.
We didn't see you there.
We're so glad you can make it to the New Year's Eve party tonight.
We're having a lot of fun. It's been going on. It's in progress. There's some beverages over there, some snacks. Help yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. The Four Loko fountain is lovely.
And there's, you can have some Coors Banquets in a nice tower, but don't remove the one that supports the whole tower or it'll all come falling down.
But yeah, fancy you stumbling on us right now. Ben and I were just about to start talking about our top 5 books for the year 2023. The year of our Lord, 2023.
It's the season of reflection, the season of renewal, and the season of planning ahead. And we're so glad that you could join us as we reflect on our year of reading in the year of our Lord, 2023.
They don't just let anyone in here.
Only the real heads.
Well, yeah, so let's get down to chatting, Ben. Wait, let me take a minute to light my big cigar.
Wow, it's the biggest cigar I've ever seen.
You know, so what they say, Ben, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, but sometimes it is a penis.
Wow, you were just smoking on that normally, and it did not intend any other meaning.
Well, Ben, why don't you kick us off?
So, I am John. We were talking about this beforehand, and I believe you're choosing to go the unordered route.
Yes.
All your books are equal in terms of your reflections. I'm going to at least list mine in ascending order. So starting at the bottom of the top 5, I cheated and made it a split entry. It includes The Slinks by Tatiana Tolstaya, a NYRB book, I might add, and Orang Orang Bloomington by Booty Dharma. Now, I picked these because in January, my friends and I started a book club that we meet almost every Wednesday at the local bar. Shout out the Bishop Book Club. And each guy gets to pick a book, and we just did that for basically the year. And these 2 picks were 2 of my favorites. I can't remember who picked Orang Orang Bloomington, but I picked The Slinks, and both excellent. To talk about them briefly, The Slinks is a sort of Russian post-apocalyptic satire about how reading can help you, but also will not give you the tools you need for revolution. Because if nobody remembers anything, there's no point in doing a revolution. And so the Slinks is the titular creature that will basically freeze you and kill you if you start thinking too much about why there's one person in charge in post-apocalyptic Russia. Also, everyone has a mutation. Some people can breathe fire. The leader, whose name I'm forgetting, the leader of this society, is a very small man with huge hands. And when he's finally introduced, it talks about how he sits on everyone's knee and goes, "You're doing such a great job making money for me." And he's just a tiny man with huge hands.
I think you like that book because you too are a small man with big hands.
I mean, I don't identify with the leader. I identify with the guy who reads too much.
Are you sure?
So.
Are you sure?
I mean, I'm also a small man with big hands, sure, but I read plenty of other books, so it's not just that. But it's a very bitter satire about how you can read to improve structures of power, but if you don't actually learn anything from what you're reading, then it does nothing. And it's sort of an interesting book in terms of like a great satire of like this post-apocalyptic Russian world where like everybody refers to each other as like Gobchik, which is like brother, and they all like live together, but they don't understand what they're doing or why this one guy's in charge. And eventually he leads a revolution, but it fixes nothing. So a great bit of post-apocalyptic sci-fi that's like written in this like really addictive narrative voice. And then the other one, which we also read, Orang Orang Bloomington, is a book by Booty Dharma. He's a guy from Indonesia who actually moved to Bloomington in like the 70s to do his dissertation on Jane Austen. And he wrote a book about how isolated, miserable, and lonely everyone in Midwest America is, except it's also extremely funny. So the opening story is about this guy who lives in a house in a part of town, and he names like specific streets in Bloomington where nobody lives except 3 old women. And he looks out his window and he sees this old man point a gun at a tree every morning. And neither of the old women want to talk to him, and he goes, I need to meet this old man. And so he's like chasing this old man around town. There's a great scene where he goes into the bathroom and he's like, he doesn't see the old man, but then he hears the old man say, bang, bang, bang from behind a stall. He's like, finally, I'll get to talk to this old man. But the old man is tragically killed in a misunderstanding, and that's how the story ends. And so it's like these absurdist stories that like sometimes get really fanciful, but are ultimately really grounded in like this experience of like being lonely and isolated and Midwestern. And I think they're kind of funny, but a lot of people in my book club found them upsetting. And they said like, I'm not like the people from Bloomington. I'm like, but the point is, it's like making fun of them and also like kind of absurd. But the same point is like, you can't be too isolated. Like you need community. And I think that's partly what it's about. Like another one is about a guy trying to bully his father into recognizing him, but then his father starts bullying him by pretending to be sick and like making him take care of him. Yeah, so two great reading experiences, two great, I think, different perspectives on stuff that we all kind of have a normal take on, and you get to see it from the other side of things.
Well, that was cheating, but I'll allow it.
Thank you.
They both sound fascinating. So, listener, I'll be frank with you. I don't like numerically ranking things. I've never been good at it. So yeah, all these books more or less are in the same place. So just keep that in mind as I go through this. It's not a strict ranking. Coming in at number 5 for me is Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres by Mr. Henry James. This was a book that I read with the Catherine Project this year. I don't believe I've ever mentioned the Catherine Project on the show before. It is a group I've been a part of for a little over a year. I started reading with them last summer, not summer of 2023, summer of 2022. But they're a nonprofit group. They basically arrange reading groups for people who want to read, good books, and it facilitates discussion, and it's a really, really cool thing I've been a part of for a while now, and definitely recommend checking them out if you, like me, are kind of out of college and want to have some kind of deep conversations about literature. Really, really recommend it. I've had a wonderful experience there, including reading this particular book. So this book I read for a group I was in. Henry James was kind of a waspy blue blood in the late 1800s. And he was, I believe, an ambassador for the Lincoln White House to somewhere in Europe for a while. But he wrote this phenomenal kind of travelogue and artistic reflection and like architectural reflection on these two cathedrals, the titular Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres. I think most people have probably heard of Chartres. Probably one of the sort of examples of Gothic architecture in the Middle Ages. Mont Saint-Michel is an earlier building, built in kind of like the 900s. Obviously, things took a lot longer to build back then, especially like projects on this scope of these buildings. But he just writes in this fascinating register. He's like a kind of person, like I really like this book because it's kind of a register we don't get a lot anymore, which is someone who's very, very well educated, but maybe isn't like a trained, like credentialed expert in a field. Like Henry James was not an architect, but he was someone who had read very, very deeply, been educated very, very deeply. And so he kind of sees these beautiful buildings, and they obviously summon up a lot of thoughts for him, and he compiles these thoughts into kind of these part art criticism, part travelogue, part really just kind of almost ekphrastic like dialogue on politics and God and all these different topics. These buildings are so amazing. They're really they represent the culmination of like so much in like cultures they were built in, that there's so many like kind of little things you can pull out and analyze. And I just found it so fascinating to just really dive deeply into like two buildings and like look at what they tell us about like the human condition and about the world they were built in. And I really love like kind of art about art. And so this was a good book for me there.
Did he write that as like part of his travels, or like was he commissioned to write it?
Yeah, it was just kind of part of his travels. I don't believe like the French government asked him to do it or anything like that.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. Back in the day, you could a self-taught man, you could write a reflection on a building and just kind of vibe with it.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Vibes, they're good.
Moving right along.
Number four.
Yeah. giant number 4 countdown. I read Herman Melville's Marty. Now, Marty is kind of an incredible book because maybe you're familiar with Herman Melville, but he grew famous because he wrote a series of travel narratives initially, before he wrote Moby Dick, that were about sailing in Polynesia and based on his own experiences. And he was very famous. The audience for this work existed and wanted to know about like Polynesian life. And he eventually got kind of irritated that people liked him so much. And before he went full hog for Moby Dick, he wrote Marty, which he says in the beginning of Marty, many people thought that I had made this up. He goes, when I wrote my travel narratives before this, Taipi and Ume, I think, they're like, many people thought I made them up, but they were true. So this time he goes, I'm going to make something up and hopefully somebody will think it is true. And so he writes kind of like a Rabelaisian, Don Quixote-esque satire / like riff on Polynesian travel. But he makes up characters serve strange functions. There's a hero narrative that he just abandons so he can do like picaresque riffs on various islands in Polynesia. The 3 main characters are basically 3 aspects, I would argue, of Herman Melville. There's Babylanja, who's like this Socratic existentialist questioning philosopher guy. There's Yumi, the poet, who writes little verses about how great everything is. And then there's King Media, who's like the straight man. And then there's the narrator. And the narrator is somebody who like wants to save this woman. He's like, I need to find this woman, and then he just forgets about it, so that like, because Melville clearly is more interested in like doing riffs. And so like every so often the characters will argue about a philosophical topic. Babylanja will do his bit, Yumi will do his bit, and the book is like really just that. And there's like paragraphs on what a good library looks like. There's paragraphs on what pipes versus cigarettes, like why it's better to smoke a pipe than have a cigarette. At one point he says a pipe is man's best friend, and then he refers to cigarettes as a skull and bones. And so memento mori.
I have one thing to say to that.
See, a cigar is man's best friend. It is there on the end of the year and will be there in the beginning. So it's a great book if you already kind of like Melville and you want to see him just kind of like riffing, because he clearly just tries out a lot of stuff that he then like, I would say, perfects in Moby Dick. And it was a lot of fun to read somebody just kind of do whatever. This book was not received very well. People thought it was too long and had too much going on. But I think Melville felt he needed to write it so that he could do things that aren't just kind of reporting. And so the plot, there's not really a lot of plot. But if you like Rabelais, if you like Don Quixote, if you like books that are just about like trying stuff out, I think you'll like Marty.
That sounds really cool. It didn't make it onto my list, not because it's bad, because frankly it'd feel a little cliche to have it on a top 5. I read Moby Dick for the first time this year, and I did really like it. From what you're telling me, it sounds like this Marty book is, it really sounds like a prototype for Moby Dick, which is also a book really more about riffs than anything else.
There's even a prototypical whale riff, because like in Moby Dick he has like here are the classification of whales, and in Marty he does one for sharks, and he's like, this shark is the New York lawyer of the sea. So stuff like that.
There we go. All right, cool. Well, my number 4, insofar as I have one, I'm going to give it to Little Friend by Donna Tartt, which I read, probably one of the last books I finished this year, but a book that I really, really enjoyed. I have been a Donna Tartt head for a little while. I read The Secret History about 2 years ago and kind of blew my mind, more than I ever thought certified Oprah's book club list pick ever would. And Little Friend, I had kind of been putting it off for a little bit, and I picked it up on the advice of my girlfriend, and I really, really liked it. One thing I'm realizing with Donna Tartt as I read more of her is that she is an incredibly funny author. The Secret History kind of like presents itself as a melodrama, and then kind of as you think more about it, like the funnier that book becomes. And Little Friend is kind of more up forwardly a comedy with kind of a darker like twist in the background. So I'd say it's kind of, again, almost kind of like inverting the Secret History in a way. But I'd say the real book I compared it to probably the most is To Kill a Mockingbird, of all things. So it's about a precocious young girl living in like the South in like the 60s, and kind of just the various scrapes and japes she gets into. It's a book that kind of like Marty, it doesn't have a plot. It's really more about just kind of the vibes and the characters and spending time watching people bounce off one another. The plot is ostensibly she's going to solve like the murder of her brother, but very quickly like that is not forgotten, but it becomes clear that that's not really what the book's about. And spoiler alert, if she never solves the murder, it's not really about that. But hilarious, and if you were a precocious child, you'll almost certainly see a lot of yourself in this book, which I appreciated. I don't want to toot my own horn or anything, but I was definitely a fucking snot-nosed kid who knew more than was good for me and was incredibly annoying to everyone in my life. So I liked it. What can I say? Not as much as The Secret History, but absolutely a phenomenal read. Donna Tartt, keep wearing those big suits. We love you, baby.
Yeah, killing it. Yeah. So, well, reading, as much as reading is about like vibing, having fun, it's also about feeling seen. So
it's true.
We all want to feel seen in some way. I think that kind of is a clumsy segue into my number 3.
Number 3.
So, is Falling Hour by Jeffrey Morrison, that was published this year. Jeffrey Morrison is a Twitter mutual of mine on the corner of book Twitter that I can stand personally. And he's a very thoughtful, intelligent guy, and he wrote a really interesting, I guess I would call it like man walking around thinking about his life book. And the narrator in it is a Scottish Scottish person who has a stay-at-home job, who lives in Canada, and he has thousands of dollars in debt, and he's basically just walking around thinking about his life. And you get reflections on like, what does it mean to have a Marxist concept of history, and how when you're arguing about political systems, you're also arguing about relationships and vice versa. It's a book about CIA gyms. In other words, the guy from The Office who worked for the CIA for the Jack Reacher movie, he's a prominent character in this book for some reason that I'm still thinking about. But anytime the narrator refers to CIA gyms, he's referring to like the idea that there are people who watch you all the time in case you might do something. He talks about Canada as being a horrible country comprised of nothing but Methodists who will do nice to you and then act better than you as they do nice to you. He talks about the spirit of Calvinism and world history. Yeah, and no surprise, he hates Calvinism. He talks about the importance of the movie The Conversation, directed by Coppola. And I think what was really great about this kind of book is, if you're sort of like me and John, not exactly there for the plot, you can see some wonderful writing that sort of weaves in like descriptions of art, history. Oh yeah, John Keats is a big person in this book. The narrator is very into John Keats, and he like goes through Keats's letters and sort of talks about Keats as a person. There's a part where he's talking about how much he loves Virginia Woolf, and then he pulls a quote where Virginia Woolf says that self-taught men are boring and upsetting, and then the narrator goes, "But I'm a self-taught man." So there's like some wonderful reflections on history, narrative, and like first-person stuff. And if you're not into plot, the plot is basically he walks to this part of the park and sees a tree, and then the tree influences how his brain works. And then he walks to a pond, he looks at the pond, and then the pond influences how his brain works. And that's basically the plot. I won't spoil the ending. Something big happens at the end, but for me, I was there just for the narrative. I've heard it's compared to Sebald, but I haven't actually read Sebald. It reminded me a little bit more of like Bolaño's first-person narrators, who we may talk about next season. We'll have to see. Stay tuned. Yeah, really wonderful read. I didn't even know like Jeffrey had been working on a book, and then he posted about it, and I bought it and read it, and it was wonderful.
Love that. Give Jeffrey a follow. I personally have not done so yet, but I will be. Yeah, that sounds really, really cool. I always love a book where I can tell the author has probably listened to some very particular podcasts I've also listened to.
He also does a couple other things where he starts talking about like memes that like are only like 2020. Like he talks about how much sea foam sucks as a color, and he goes on like basically a like Thomas Bernhard, like I hate everything rant at times, but since he's not Thomas Bernhard, it's like more modulated. But he's like, I've never seen sea foam in real life. Have you? That's what happens. But anyway, yeah.
And whatever happened to coffee flavored coffee?
Yeah, I just want to. I don't want a frappuccino, cappuccino. Yeah,
Maca Facchiata.
yeah. Al Pacino. I don't want that. I want coffee flavored coffee. Yeah. So I think he's listened to some of the same podcasts you have. The narrator has, and I found that to be very relatable. And I also felt seen.
There you go. Love that. Number 3 for me. Actually, it's a book we've already talked about on the show, but it is The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. It's a book that I had read before. I had loved before when Ben and I were originally sitting down to kind of think about the show and what we wanted to do here. It became pretty obvious pretty quick it had to be our first episode, and it's a book that I have really not been able to stop thinking about since I put it down, which might mean that it's already time for a reread. I think actually I'm going to try to read some different Eco in the new year. I've had Baudolino on my shelf for quite a few years now without actually getting to it, and I think might be time to get around to that, as well as maybe like Foucault's Pendulum. But Name of the Rose, I mean, I don't know what I can say that we didn't say on that episode. It was a pretty exhaustive it really wasn't exhaustive. Actually, I feel like as soon as we finished that episode, we were like, oh man, we could have talked about that for another like hour and a half at least. But just a really towering achievement. Like when I think about literature and I think about myself as a writer or an aspiring writer, and I think about what I want to create, Name of the Rose is a book that stands like very tall over like my idea of like what literature can do, like drawing in so many different elements of history and philosophy and literature itself. Eco was clearly a real Renaissance man who, read very deeply, but also was so knowledgeable about so many other things and loved not just kind of highbrow literature, but also like lowbrow. And, he loves detective stories and genre fiction, while also elevating those things to ask what, our affection for those stories means, to ourselves as readers on a deeper level. And yeah, it's a book that I really like. I kind of don't know what to say entirely, because it is kind of the whole like. I really struggle to think of like a novel that does more than Name of the Rose. There are definitely novels that maybe are more experimental, maybe novels that have more sparkling prose. But when I think about a novel that really pushes the form as far as it can go, and that loves being a book, what
else is there?
Yeah, what else is there?
Yeah.
I can't think of it. I can't think of anything else that's better right now. So,
I do want to tack something onto that, John. So there was something that I wanted to say when we did that episode, and then we didn't get time to it, but it's very relevant for this episode we're doing today. And Umberto Eco really loves lists. And we're making a list right now. Why are we making this list? Well, we could say we're doing it because everyone else is doing it. We could say we're doing it because we want to be reflective. But according to Umberto Eco, it's because we don't want to die. And so in this interview on lists, he says, the list doesn't destroy culture, it creates it. Whenever you look in cultural history, you will find lists. In fact, there is a dizzying array, lists of saints, armies, medicinal plants, treasures, book titles. Think of the nature collections of the 16th century. My novels, by the way, are full of lists. And then later he says, along with the death quote, we have a limit, a very discouraging, humiliating limit, death. That's why we like all the things that we assume have no limits and therefore no end. It's a way of escaping thoughts about death. We like lists because we don't want to die. And I think Umberto Eco's book is very good about that. And it's also full of lists as well.
Yeah, as I've gotten older, really over I'll say like the last 3-4 years, listener, I'm sure that, Ben and I will tell more of our stories as we get deeper into this project. But I kind of came back to reading after a long break in 2019. And as I've gotten older, it's like you kind of have to embrace like the fact that you're not gonna be able to read everything, and that's a big part of like what this show is about, actually.
Yeah.
As we conceived it, and learning to love the fact that when you read your last book, you will have a list. Whether or not it's recorded anywhere is another question. I think that Ben and I are kind of putting a list together here, but you will have a list, and you have to learn to love the fact that there will be a list, and that list will have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And yeah, as I've gotten older, life is about learning to kind of love the particular place you're in. And I think that Eco understood that, and I think Name of the Rose is a book that understands that. And yeah, what a book.
What a book. And with our list, we're also trying to make sense of our particular year as well. So
yeah, absolutely. Well,
moving on. Number 2. Okay, number 2. So number 2 was a book that was published last year that I really loved, that I'd kept setting time away for. And it's Annex by Blake Butler. Now, you might be familiar. This was published under Apocalypse Party, which is something John and I have been meaning to talk about. Is sort of like,
we're big fans.
Yeah, we love it. Yeah.
Please come on the podcast.
Yeah. Apocalypse Party, we'd love to have you. And B.R. Yeager, big one. Shipley, big one. Blake Butler, I'd say another one. He actually just published a book this year that I haven't got around to called Molly. But I read Annex this year. Annex is an insane book. And I think to talk about it in a brief way without getting too off in the weeds, most authors, I think, want to write a story that represents something. But Blake Butler, if you read his blog posts, if you read his Twitter presence, he wants his language to do something. So if you're writing about something, you don't just write about it in your standard representational mode. If you're writing about, say, in this book, it would be a post-apocalyptic future where Satan has rewritten the Bible and we're all strapped to computer chairs all the time and we can't leave. Then you need your language to actually depict that reality as opposed to just represent it. And of course, like when you're depicting it, it's a representation, but as a result, the language is fragmented. It's written in a kind of pseudocode. There's weird shifts of like sort of Cormac McCarthy Dyer-esque imagery with like hallucinatory, horrifying things involving blood and pus and skin and technology. And it's like, imagine it's a world where you can never log off is kind of what Annex by Blake Butler is. And occasionally...
the truest of hells.
You can never log... In fact, there's a bit where one of the characters who's speaking goes, I didn't know you could turn the feed off. At least what the character says. And along with this, you get like sort of characters who speak in first person. And the best character by far is imagine a Gen X musician who is then captured by a evil satanic corporation and forced to make music that causes people to not revolt, at which point he then realizes that his dream of authenticity is forever tarnished, and he then becomes a warmonger and sells weapons of mass destruction to other companies. And the whole time he's justifying his actions, he's doing it in this weird like Gen X like band speak, and this guy basically talks at you for like 50 pages, and he's like, you can't leave, you have to pay attention to what I'm saying, because like, again, this is like some horrible hell that we live in. Really an insane book, and one that I had to like set time away for, because the way he writes is a way that I think like Burroughs writes in terms of cut-ups, and the way James Joyce writes in terms of Finnegan's Wake, where it's stuff you have to like really not read and expect something to happen. You have to just look at the language and figure out what's happening, as opposed to like, oh, am I going to get exposition dump? No. Am I going to get main characters that explain everything? No. In fact, one of the main characters just dies, and the book goes like, you would have thought that this main character is going to be alive, but she's dead now. Like, so a lot of stuff that you have to really set aside time for, but one that I think is like worth the effort, and also is very stark and depressing and brutal as well.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
That sounds like quite the book.
yeah, and Blake Butler apparently did it again this year with Molly, which I haven't read, but he's really, I think he's really reinventing a lot of stuff that you expect from people writing in small presses, and it's really worth the attention.
I mean, not to dick ride too much, but Apocalypse Party, again, great press, like doing really awesome work. Like, you know, I really want to like eventually get to a point where we can talk with people like either with them or with other presses. Like, there are so many cool indie presses right now doing like really exciting stuff. Like, that I think is really where the really cool stuff in the art form is being done. Like, I'm not saying nothing being published in kind of like the mainstream space is worth your time, but the stuff that's really pushing the boundaries of the novel, or, you know, whatever genre you prefer, it's being done at indie presses like Apocalypse Party right now. And yeah, I'm definitely gonna have to check out the Annex, because I had not heard about that one.
I mean, you gotta have to go in knowing like you're not gonna get anything familiar.
I don't want anything familiar. I don't want exposition. One thing I've learned a loathe over the years is exposition of any kind.
And there's an effect that I can only describe, that I've only read with this kind of stuff, where suddenly you put together like the background, and it's like basically like horrifying. It's like, oh, that's how we ended up at like in this world that like you're basically in and you don't know why. And eventually you put it together, which is the fact that like Satan like rewrote the Bible and it caused all this to happen. And so you're like, like, you know, like, anyway.
That actually creates kind of an interesting parallel with my number 2, because Ben forgot to do that.
I forgot to do it. Yes.
My number 2 is The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, by we're gonna edit this part out.
I know. I realized that I need to know the pronunciation of Dream of the Red Chamber's name also.
Oh wow. Okay. That's
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. My number 2, which Ben forgot to do, is The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Sangguo Yanyi, by Luo Guanzhong. This is one of the 4 classic Chinese novels, of which, as Ben and I have talked about many times, there are actually at least 6.
7.
Yeah. Oh God. But yeah, the Chinese literature is something that I have come to, I developed an interest in the last like 2 or 3 years. Seriously, you could probably tell from our episode on Notes on from a Crocodile, and the fact that I've been struggling to learn Mandarin for some time. But Romance of the Three Kingdoms was a book that it was another Catherine Project pick for me, and it is a book that I really like because it is a book about history. And for those who are unaware, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, it begins in kind of the waning years of the Han Dynasty, which was, depending on kind of how you reckon things, the second kind of fully imperial dynasty in Chinese history after the Qin dynasty. And it starts with kind of the end of that dynasty, and it ends with kind of the rise of the next dynasty. And it starts off with a beautiful epigraph, a beautiful phrase, which I think is actually one of probably the great phrases of Chinese literature, if not literature in general. The empire long divided, or the empire long united must divide, long divided must unite. And, you know, I don't want to get too political, too sappy, too whatever on the pod, But, I think I'm probably not alone here in saying that the last 3 or 4 years have felt unstable in a way that I think most of us probably never thought we were going to live through. I don't think most of us had a medieval style plague on our kind of lifetime bingo card. But this book was really cool. It's cool from, again, kind of this historical standpoint. It's a book about kind of the cycles of history, the way that things come together and fall apart and come together and fall apart, which is the whole story of the human race, at least as long as we've had something approaching civilization for thousands of years now. And it's good to know that while the world is ending in one way, there will be a new dynasty, in the long run, whatever that is, the Xi dynasty, hopefully, if we're lucky. But also this book whips ass on a much more like elemental level. There's fucking sick ass anime fights. Like every 10 pages, there are Taoist wizards doing like Bugs Bunny Looney Tunes gags to people. There's a guy who has his eye shot out with an arrow, and he pulls it out and eats it because letting his eye just like land on the ground would be unfilial to his parents, so he has to eat it. It has the greatest like bromance in the history of literature with the three brothers of the Peach Blossom Orchard Oath, Liu Bei, Guan Yu, and my boy Zhang Fei. So yeah, this is like a book that has everything, which I'm really coming to love reading kind of modern novels. Something that I think Ben and I want to talk about more is kind of like the history of like the novel as a genre, and kind of like the ways that the novel's been with us for like a lot longer than we think it has, especially in places like China.
And it's a lot more interesting than your sort of like bourgeoisie family trouble that we might think like a novel is.
Yeah.
There's a lot more experimentation and like incorporation of other things involved.
Absolutely. Like, and this book was written in like the late I want to say the late Yuan dynasty. So basically like happening contemporaneous with like the late Middle Ages in Europe. And it is like still like written in like almost like a Homeric like style, where you have these kind of martial heroes like really, fighting with each other, but there's so much depth here, and it's just an amazing book. Like, it's so fun to read. There's never like a boring moment in it. The characters are like so interesting and fun, and it really is, again, it's a book kind of like Name of the Rose, where like it really just shows you like what literature can do.
Yeah.
Like the way that it can tie all these things together into something that feels coherent in a way that maybe other media wouldn't. We watched the movie Red Cliff earlier this year, which is based on a section of this movie, and it's a great movie. We had a ton of fun watching it.
Directed by John Woo. Yeah.
Directed by John Woo. But it was like 4 hours long because it was like a weird kind of like thing the Chinese government did, where it's like it was released in like 2 parts. So it's really 2 movies, but it's meant to be watched like at once. But it's just one section of this, and like it felt like a full thing, but it also felt like one episode in like this much larger narrative. And I just love the scope this thing has, the complexity it has, the beauty of the prose. There's so much poetry in this, like literal poetry. There's a ton of parts of this book where it just will like take a break to just read you a beautiful poem that was written by an actual guy who really lived, who's in the book as a character, because it's also like based in real history. So it's not like a book I can recommend like casually. It's like the edition I have, which is from Foreign Language Press, comes out to like over 2,000 pages when all is said and done, but absolutely recommend trying to make time for this thing in your reading life eventually, or play Dynasty Warriors, I guess.
Yeah, because John, you had told me that a lot of media properties draw like from just like a chapter or two from this.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, each thing has enough scope for like a mythic story.
Oh yeah, like it's one of those things. This is like a book where you could take sections of it and you could write like a whole like contemporary like fantasy trilogy, like based in just part of this. And I have some plans.
Listener, I will do that.
So just you wait.
Yeah. And I have one other question, John, because I think you've told me this, but I might have forgotten. So, would we say that the place of this book in, say, like Chinese history is of like the past that is incredibly important and was true, but has sort of like a seismic kind of like scale? Or is it like what's the relationship between the sort of like the history of China, because this is a work of Chinese literature, like what does it play in terms of like true heroes versus like exaggeration kind of
I mean,
yeah,
that's really hard to say, honestly. Like I don't want to like cop out of the question, but it is a little difficult to say, because I think the fact of the matter is that like people reading this at the time knew that the author was embellishing things. Like there is literal magic in this book. Like there's stuff that even with kind of the more limited historical tools that people in the time period had, like people would have known that things were exaggerated or altered slightly for dramatic effect. Again, I think it comes down to, again, like something that I think you and I have talked a lot about, and I think we're going to get to more in the pod as it goes on. What are we doing here when we're writing things? Like,
yeah.
This is not meant to exactly be like a literal one-to-one transcription of history. This is meant to be something that is serving a further role besides information. I mean, if you know nothing about Chinese history and you pick this up and you read it from front to back, like you will have like at the very least a pretty broad understanding of what was going on in this time period. You won't have maybe a perfect understanding. You won't, again, it's not going to like fill in for years of graduate school training
right.
Just reading maybe some drier histories, but you'll know broad strokes of what was going on. You'll know who was where, and you'll know what dynasty followed which one. But it's more than that. The literal name for this in Chinese, yuan yi, is translated as romance.
Okay. Yeah.
But if you take the two characters in Chinese, it means something like righteous, like literature or righteous story.
Nice. Yeah.
So there's kind of an element of this where it's meant to be something that is exemplary, which, you can problematize if you really want to. I think that probably there is some stuff here that maybe isn't actually the author maybe would have found compelling or morally instructive. Maybe in 2023 we don't. But I think that it is really interesting that this is a book that is still so widely read in China. I as I was reading through this and I was reading kind of background materials, it was really cool to hear about, like, you learn about like different characters in kind of more contemporary Chinese history, like had favorite parts of this book, favorite characters.
Yeah.
Mao Zedong's favorite character is Cao Cao, who's kind of the tricky, conniving, but ultimately like ruthless, but ultimately like very practical, pragmatic character who, maybe doesn't do good things all the time, but he wants to like do what it takes to end the war as quickly as possible and like get things stable.
And he's still, at least in the movie, because I haven't read it, he's still a respectable opponent.
Yeah.
He's not like a lowly villain. He's like worthy of all of like their efforts.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so I think that that's something that's, again, not to harp on it too much or too long, but again, as I keep reading more Chinese history, what's just so interesting is, again, you have this culture that's so literate and like this literary record that goes back so far that people still read this stuff and still like are pulling things out of it that means so much to them. And like, I pulled a lot out of this that meant a lot to me.
Yeah.
And again, I think it just shows like the way we consume literature, maybe like in kind of the Anglo-West, like we've thrown so much of the baby out with bathwater. Not to say like nobody reads the Iliad anymore and like nobody gets anything out of it, but like we're so obsessed with like divvying things up into like these neat little categories, and I think that this is a book that really challenges that and is like, a book can do everything, and it can be great.
Yeah. It can be entertaining.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like, again, you can just read this because you want to see like cool anime fights and you'll get your money's worth. But if you read like 5% deeper, like you'll get a lot more out of it than that.
And I think also, last thing I'll say, and then we can move on. I think the comparison between Odyssey and Iliad is great because, I mean, those were exemplary stories as well.
Yeah.
Like, people wanted to be Odysseus because Odysseus could, was a wily tactician and he was physically fit and he could sing a song and cry and he could seduce women. Like he could do everything, and that's why he was an exemplary figure. And I think that's a useful comparison.
Absolutely,
so,
absolutely.
Yeah.
This is also a book that is all about like the end of the world.
Okay.
Because like when a dynasty, like it's something that again is a little hard to understand, like sitting here in like 2023 in America at the moment. But again, it's like China is like a civilization that like has been like, again, these people like had a complex, like advanced, like bureaucratic urban civilization while our ancestors were like digging millet out of mud in
they were working at the mud factory.
The mud factory, worshiping, Saint Bartholomew's like toenail. But like this is a book that is about like it is apocalyptic. Like when the dynasty collapses, like there is famine, there is mass starvation, mass death. The period this book is based in is still like, I think, if not the number one mass death event in human history, like in the top 5.
Holy crap, I didn't know that.
Yeah, like a bajillion people died like in this period of time. And I'm not trying to be one of those like fucking weirdos who's like, oh, it's so weird how, like, whenever anything happens in China, like, a bajillion people die. Like, at the end of the day, like, it really just comes down to the fact that, like, you have an advanced civilization. If your kind of lines of production, if, like, your ways of getting food to different places, like, collapse, like, a bunch of people die.
Yeah.
It's not anything, like, particular about China that, like, makes them more prone to, like, mass death events than other people, apart from the fact that, like, they had an advanced civilization, so a lot more people were born, and then people died when that didn't work.
Yeah.
But, yeah, this is a book, like, about an apocalypse and about, like, pulling yourself back up from the apocalypse. So that's all I gotta say. I'm gonna actually be done now. Sorry for fucking it up.
No.
Number 1!
Well, John, I'm noticing a theme here. I think this was a year for both of us reading the 4 Chinese classics, and you had said 6, and I checked. It is 6. It's not 7. There's 2 extra ones. And one of the ones
They're too dirty.
Yeah, the extra one I picked was one from a later period, which we both read. The Dream of the Red Chamber.
Ooh.
A classic by Cao Shui-Chin. And what is it about? Well, imagine a giant sort of family gossip novel involving 2 different families and a doomed romance between cousins of those families. And you're sort of...
those wonderful 9 beauties of Jinling.
The 9 beauties of Jinling. I kept asking John who was his favorite beauty of Jinling. So...
Ooh. I can't pick.
Yeah,
They're all so beautiful.
They're all beautiful to me. And it's
the 9 beauties of Jinling.
Well, what's my favorite?
More people are saying it.
I shouldn't say what my favorite is.
Should I say it, folks?
They might get mad. Well, so who are the beauties of? Well, there are all of these women. I think. Hold on. I want to say there was actually 12 beauties. The 12 beauties.
Well,
yeah.
Oh fuck.
Okay. Yeah.
Fuck.
Yeah. There are actually 12 beauties. John forgot about 3. Oh, they'll be mad. But
3 of them are mids.
Well, yeah, but we won't say who. But the book has a predominant focus on women, and because the author, when he was born rich, and his family actually lost their money, which is sort of the story of Dream of the Red Chamber. It's about a once rich feudal kind of family in China losing sort of their once former glory. partly because they couldn't stop spending so much money. It's one of the themes of the book. Many such cases, but the story follows all of this. You get all of these female characters who all have different societal expectations on who they're going to marry, how they're going to succeed, along with the main character, Precious Jade, Bao Yu, and how he has a doomed romance with his cousin, but also he may be the personification of a precious emerald, or jade rather, which fell from the sky at the beginning of time and thus wanted to live among the dusty world, is the phrase that they use in the book all the time, which is the world of attachments and desire and not sort of pure ideas and not reality. And so he wants to live among the people, and he gets to live in this giant feudal household. And the book is incredible, much like a pre-modern novel, because it consists mostly of intrigue, gossip, discussion, and it moves kind of like life does. There's no sense that there's an overwhelming plot, except for later, which maybe we'll have time, because he didn't actually finish the book, and one of his editors had to write the last 30 chapters, which is kind of like when you're watching a great TV show, and then suddenly they bring in a different writer to end the show, and you're like, what happened? All my favorite characters are not the same. But anyway, like, it proceeds almost like life does. Like, there's a misunderstanding, and it spirals out of control, and then it just kind of ends. Or there's, like, somebody who hates somebody, and so then they want to end them for chapters and chapters. And what I like so much about it is the pace of it, because he was writing it pretty much as he went along, and you get all of these great characters, the 12 beauties, so beautiful, and Bao Yu and his cousin, Dai, I think, it's like something gold is what is her name, not Precious Jade, but
Lin Dai Yu?
Yeah, Lin Dai Yu. And so the last thing, too, I'll say is that, much like as John was saying with Three Kingdoms, you get all this stuff. It's just like an entertaining story that could, like, it almost proceeds to me like a TV show, where it's just like episode after episode of just like stuff happening, but no like giant, you don't really get a sense that it's going anywhere particular until it does, because he passed away and they lost the last 30 chapters. But when you're there, you just, I don't know, it's just a picture of like feudal life. It was written in the
Qing Dynasty.
The Qing Dynasty, yeah.
So I'm going to hijack for a
moment. Yeah, hijack away, John. You know more than I do.
Chinese history corner. So again, kind of to draw parallels, like, so Roman Three Kingdoms written at the end of the Yuan Dynasty, which was the dynasty that was run by the Mongols. That was replaced by the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty falls and is replaced by the Qing Dynasty, which is run by a different group of steppe nomads than the Mongols called the Manchus. But that is the last imperial dynasty in China. So there's a good chunk of time between these two things being written, but actually being written under semi-similar circumstances. But Dream of the Red Chamber is definitely, like, I think a little more modern in its kind of vernacular and its concerns. Bao Yu, despite, absolutely a great character, not a fighter.
In fact, he says he'd much rather hang out with women than men, is what he says multiple times.
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, again, not to kind of dive too much back to our episode on Notes of a Crocodile, but I did like find almost kind of like not quite a trans narrative in this book, but it is really interesting. Like, this book is a book that has a lot to say about like gender.
Yeah.
And gender, like, in a very different like time and place than like we experience it like here in, again, 2023 Anglosphere sense. You know, I remember us like sitting down and talking about this book in like May of this year and being like, I'm not going to call Bao Yu a trans woman because that's like a category that I don't know we could apply to like a person growing up in like the Qing Dynasty.
Well, at one point, Bao Yu says things would be easier if I was a girl than a man, and all the characters just laugh at her. And that's it. Like, just go, oh, Bao Yu, you're so dumb. Yeah, like,
could transition have saved her? Psych, she saved herself by becoming enlightened after acing the imperial examination.
Yeah, so one of the things that happens in this book that is great is that the 12 beauties of Jinling either die or get married off, and Bao Yu is left all alone, and it's this sort of like time to put away childish things. But then, because again, his editor, who is not the author, steps in and he becomes enlightened, and then he turns into an asshole, and all of the girls that he loves, he's like, I can't talk to you. And then he studies for 3 days, aces the Imperial exam, saves his family from dissolution, and then disappears and joins a monastery. And it's one of the most insane, if we wanted to think of it as like a season of television, just imagine that all of the character, like the main character just became like a saint and then just left the show. That's like basically what happens.
Yeah, Tony Soprano actually fulfills his mother's dream and becomes a Catholic saint.
Yeah, and he leaves. He renounces the
I can't
the mob.
talk to you, Paulie.
Yeah, Paulie, I can't talk. I'm sorry. I'm thinking about God. Yeah.
But like Ben said, I read this one too. It only didn't make it onto my list because I knew it was going to make it onto Ben's list. I wanted to make sure we got like as much breadth as possible here. But again, it's one of those things where when you really delve into like what the form of the novel can do, like it makes you like frustrated that you're living in 2023 in a way, because our idea of like what a story can be is just so constrained. And I know part of it is that like this is a book that's like Ben compared this to a TV show. Like this is to some degree like limited by the fact like this is the only way to tell a story in a way in like this time period. Not the only way, but there was no TV. You couldn't have a soap opera like on television, so you have to have a soap opera in a book.
And you couldn't even before the story starts, 2 minor characters talk about the natures of stories, and it's almost the author going, "Listen, I'm not going to write about characters that can do magic or are, exemplary figures. I'm just going to write about normal people that happen to be really rich, but normal people who are both good and bad." And I think like that's him, like you were saying, like kind of making space for a realistic story at the time when certainly people were writing them, but you kind of had to justify why you were doing that.
Yeah, this is a really interesting time period in like Chinese literature. There's so many different like vernaculars of storytelling like going on at this time. And again, that's great because again, it shows like what all you can do with a novel. Like the idea that like fantastical literature is like inherently like obviously like in 2023 in the Anglosphere, like the bias is still like towards like realist literature. And this book is at some level like an example of kind of more realist literature, not in the way that maybe like we would typically think of it, but there's so many things going on at this time. This is like around the same time like Journey to the West with the Monkey King is being written. There's like all these books. There's a whole genre called like gods and monsters novels being written at this time period, which are just about like gods and monsters. And so it's just the novel can do so fucking much, and we keep limiting it to just being like, what if we did a bad soap opera? What if we talked about how there's an English professor in Missouri who's sad
and his life is unfulfilling
and his name is Stoner?
And what if we talked about how all of his enemies are handicapped in some way and he's the perfect special boy?
The Stoner episode will happen eventually,
but it'll be
no one's asking for it. But Ben and I love joking about it.
It'll be also be me hating on Stoner.
It'll also be me hating on Stoner. We don't like Stoner. This is an anti-Stoner podcast. We also hate people who smoke weed. If you're smoking weed right now, stop.
Stop. Read a book. Read a book that's not about smoking weed or Stoner.
But anyway, Dream of the Red Chamber. Banger, much like Romance Through Kingdom, like 2,000 something pages. Not something you can like take up lightly. I cannot believe I got through both these books without blowing my brains out.
Well, but I think that's like you were saying. There's just so much there that you're almost never bored. At least for me.
Exactly. I mean, again, it just goes to show like what books can do, what novels can do. Like, I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be the guy who's like, TV is the bad version of books, but it is. Stop watching TV. Read a book.
There's also been 2 television adaptations of Dream of the Red Chamber.
Absolutely. Romance Through Kingdoms as well. A lot of movies, a lot of book, a lot of TV shows, a lot of video games. there are a lot of ways to experience these narratives. I don't know. I don't know.
Wait, John. If there was a video game version of Dream of the Red Chamber, it would be one of those like dating sims.
Yeah, be a dating sim.
Except instead of trying to date,
you can't win.
Yeah, well, you can't win, and instead of trying to date the women that live with you, you have to basically learn to be friends with them, because that's all Bao Yu wants to do. Is he just wants to be friends with all of the women, including the maids who nobody likes. He likes the maids. He's great. He loves women. but like that would be the Dream of the Red Chamber game version.
He's a girl's guy.
Yeah, he's a girl's guy, and then he becomes
that as a girl's guy.
Yeah, and then and then he becomes enlightened, and the romance is doomed between him and his cousin, unfortunately.
Well,
now it's time for your number one, John.
Woof. All right, so my last pick, and really, this is the only one I'm actually going to firmly assign a number to. This is actually my number one book of the year. And that is Nagarjuna's The Middle Way.
Whoa.
This was another Catherine Project read. Shout out to my boy Will for leading a group on this. So this is one I gotta provide a look at this for. So, Ben, are you familiar with the division between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism?
Only in the most crudest sense.
Okay. Well, to make a long story very short, Nagarjuna is one of the pivotal figures in that division. Have you heard of the doctrine of emptiness?
That all is nothing?
To some degree.
A little bit, also in the crudest sense.
So, if you've heard that idea before, which I feel like at this point a lot of Westerners have, through kind of like translated Zen stuff, etc., that is where Nagarjuna is the originator of that idea. And the place that idea is explicated is in this book. Even calling it a book is actually like a little bit off. So this is a text that I read this year, like I said, through this Catherine Project group, led by my friend Will. It is actually a series of poetic couplets, originally written in Sanskrit.
You're supposed to memorize, right?
You're supposed to memorize them. And then I read the version I had some commentaries attached to them. Basically worked out from Japanese and another language. I think also Sanskrit, maybe Pali. By some very, very talented English language translators. But this is a book of philosophy that I really just cannot even fully this is a book that is so hard for me to even put into words. It is a book that the reason it is here in this space is because I finished this book in June. I have not thought about this book a single day since I put it down.
Holy crap.
This book, I cannot I cannot understate this. It changed the entire way I look at the world.
Wow. Yeah.
I thought I understood Buddhism. I thought I understood, again, I have a degree in religious studies. I studied Buddhism in my undergrad. I took classes on this stuff. I did not understand any of this stuff till I read this book. And I understand it, I still don't understand it, but, I understand it more than I did before. This is a book that, have you ever read a book, Ben, that feels like the lament configuration from Hellraiser? Not in a bad way.
I can't.
But it's a puzzle box, and when you open it, the whole world opens up to you in a new way.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Probably only like once or twice.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think that like the human mind can like do that more than like 2 or 3 times in like a single lifetime.
Yeah.
But this book, like I was reading it, and I this is like a book that like I felt like Jacob like wrestling with the angel when I was reading this book. Like,
yeah.
I was reading it, and like I would come up on something, and like I would be like, that doesn't make sense. And then I would like read through it like 2 or 3 times and I'd be like, fuck, that makes absolute sense. And everything I thought before this makes no sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's so amazing. This book was written in like before Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Like this is a work of like truly like ancient literature. Like I think this was written like 600 AD. And it shows like an understanding of like phenomenology. Like it's asking questions and like reaching conclusions that would not be reached in like Western philosophy until the 1800s.
Yeah.
Like with people like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, who are literally just jacking people who are influenced by Nagarjuna.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Like the ideas here are just so like I'm still like I said, I'm still processing this book. Like I still cannot fully put into words like what this book did for me. But this is like, listener, this is like a hard book to recommend because it is like a book that if you are not coming, like if I had not been in like a group discussing this book on a weekly basis, I probably just would have been like, I don't want to read this.
Yeah.
And I think that's like the power of like reading with other people and like why I really believe in that. And like, I hope eventually maybe like this podcast can like become a thing where like we're doing that with people.
Yeah.
But like this book, it blew my mind. Like I almost feel like I cannot put into words exactly what this book did because it's so fundamentally like altered my perception of like reality. Like this is a book that like I thought I knew the world, and I finished this book and I didn't anymore.
Well, I know in you talking to me about it, you had talked about how it sort of like applies the doctrine of emptiness to like some of the core precepts of Buddhism.
Yeah.
And sort of demonstrates that like even those are, I think the term in the intro is like conceptual fictions.
Yeah.
Where they're convenient for explanatory purposes, but they're ultimately not what is true.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, this is a book where it's like, that's what I really respected about this book is that, you know, you read, I mean, I'm simplifying a bit here, and if anyone wants to like call me out, absolutely do, because I want to read more stuff like this. But you read like Christian theology, and Christian theology works because it accepts like a certain set of priors and just says these are true.
Right.
And maybe there are like authors who do go back and like try to like prove those. Like this is a book that is so ruthless, even with its own like tradition. But still, like, you finish this book and it's like, okay, I understand you just disproved the idea of the Buddha, but you also, like, made me think the Buddha is real in, like, a way that, like, I don't know that I can, like, logically believe in Christ.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and, too, the idea that, like, is it... I don't remember if they talk about Indra's net in this, but the idea of like it's not like perceiving subjects who perceive objects to be true. It's like the act of perceiving generates the subject and the object like simultaneously.
Yeah.
Like, and so like, which again sounds like an incredibly heady idea, but it's very important for my understanding of what Nagarjuna wants to say about Buddhism and why you should even be Buddhist.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It doesn't directly like use that metaphor, but that metaphor is like being drawn from this.
Yeah, yeah.
Or vice versa.
Because that's what Nishida talks about in Japanese philosophy is it's the act of perceiving that gives birth to subject and object, not us Americans perceiving this thing to be true.
Yeah.
It's like that act which is generative.
This is a book that again, like it assaulted like my way of looking at the world, and not in a bad way. Like, frankly, again, I this is a bonus episode, so I don't want to get like too in the weeds here. But like the way we look at reality and again like the Anglo West is so clearly bullshit.
Yeah.
Like absolute fucking nonsense.
Well, that's what you said. You talked about phenomenology in Europe, and it's because people were going, well, maybe, Cartesian subjectivity isn't the end all be all.
Yeah.
And again, Nagarjuna had been there,
for centuries.
Centuries. Yeah. It's not you perceiving things to be true. There's other things going on. So,
again, this is like one where I want to recommend this book to everyone, but I know that like it's not an easy read. Like I said, it's written in like a vernacular that is very like unfamiliar and like in a style that's unfamiliar.
Yeah, I'm gonna read it in 2024, but I read the introduction about conceptual fictions and I had to put it down and like think about conceptual fictions. I was like, so wait a minute, that means that the idea of a bed isn't true. It's just convenient. like it's convenient to have the idea of a bed, but it's not something that's actually true.
Well,
so,
and the thing with this book that again just really blew my mind is like this book, like it runs through like this book kind of like reading this book felt kind of like going back to like my philosophy 101 class. Like the second chapter is like basically doing like the who's the guy in Western philosophy who's like does like the race of Achilles versus the tortoise where
Zeno.
It's like Zeno.
Yeah.
It does that.
Yeah.
And then it actually like pulls it out even further and it's like, hey, not even is motion not true? There's no such thing as time.
Wow. Yes.
And it's like, that's just, it just keeps doing that.
Yeah, and then it does it to core tenets of Buddhism, right?
The Buddha and the Four Noble Truths.
Yeah.
And like everything you think is like settled in the world or should be settled in the world from this world to you, it's like, no. It's empty.
Wow.
Like,
yeah.
And yeah.
And again, this isn't meant to be like depressingly empty.
No.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. It's all about like what actually works.
Right. Yeah.
Like, what is actually going to like make you less miserable, like bring you towards like liberation, whatever that means. Like again, I don't know. I'm still like the last couple chapters I'm still like wrestling with. Like I don't have an answer to it. And I'm like still really wrestling with again, like what does this mean in terms of like my own subjectivity is again like someone who was raised with the like Judeo-Christian Cartesian like style of thinking. Like I read Maimonides, the Guide for the Perplexed, summer before this with not the same group altogether, but like it was another Catherine Project reading group. It was led by the same guy, my friend Will. Shout out Will. And like that gave me like a whole other perspective on like kind of biblical religion and like again kind of more platonic like sense of things. And I'm still like really figuring out like how to. I don't know if I can reconcile them. Like I'm still like figuring out like what does all this shit mean? Like I don't have that yet. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. Again, something that we haven't talked a lot about on the podcast, but I feel like we want to talk about is just like books. The power of books is that like a book can change, like a book can change your life. Like it can change the way you look at the world in a way that, any other like art form, frankly, I really do not think like a painting or a movie can do. That's not to like discount those art forms. I love film. I love painting. I love every art form.
I mean, Archaic Torso of Apollo, the Rilke poem is about him looking at a statue of Achilles and realizing.
But then he writes a poem.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because the poem is like it ends with him going, "You must change your life," and then he writes the poem to sort of capture that.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that like I really do think there's something unique about literature in terms of how it can change the way you think. I think that's why powers that be don't want people reading anymore.
You gotta be watching videos.
You gotta be on TikTok all the time. But
well,
I'm rambling and like we need to cut this off.
Well, I was gonna say this might be a good idea to talk about stuff moving forward. Now that we're talking about 2024, reading books that make you continually change what you want to do. What are we gonna do in 2024 with reading? What should we? What are we taking in?
Absolutely. So wait, before we get to that, Ben, like you said you wanted to do something with this. So you tell us about what you wanted.
Okay, I have a brief odds and ends. One is a quick hate read that I'll just put in briefly. Last Exit to Brooklyn, Hubert Selby Jr., not great. Why is it not good? Hubert Selby Jr. was a big influence on the Velvet Underground and Lou Reed because he was writing about sort of criminals and the lower economic class of New York at the time in a brutally honest way that nobody else was doing. However, I found it to be incredibly annoying because everybody who basically is living this life dies. They all die in tragically fucked up, disgusting ways, almost as if Hubert Selby Jr. was saying, if you're one of these people, you too will die. You will be punished for your sins. And in some ways, it's a very, like, you know, Calvinist, like, these are clearly the preterite, they're not the elect, they're destined to die, and I found that to be aggravating. But its influence on the Velvet Underground was something that I found to be fascinating, and oh, excuse me, it's written in this kind of like proto-modernist expressive style where you're walled in with these characters and their subjectivities in ways that don't adhere to normal paragraph breaks or like normal sentences structure, which can be interesting to read and I think maybe communicates to how people get bowled over by this book.
Yeah.
But if you sit and think about it for a second, you're like, wait, all of these people that we're supposed to care for end up dying tragically because they commit these crimes. Oh, how tragic, you know, like, and some people think Hubert Selby Jr. was a big influence on Infinite Jest, where despite DFW's, like, clear affection for degenerates and drug addicts, has them all punished in horrifying ways because he believes that they should be punished. So anyway, hate read, don't read that. Quick honorable mentions, Under Milkwood, Dylan Thomas, great play for voices. If you want to read something short that features people talking in expressive Welsh ways, Under Milkwood. And then I just wanted to plug The Lime Twig by John Hawkes. John Hawkes is somebody who people always talk about, but they don't read anymore, and you can find in a used bookstore. And John Hawkes gives no fucks. He will describe everything, and he hates plot. So that's kind of why we like him here at the Infinite Library. Now, moving forward in 2024, I want to read Argajuna. I have it on my to-read list. And I also want to read more poetry, because I feel like the poetry muscle of my brain has kind of atrophied.
Absolutely.
And I think you kind of have to practice reading to get better at it, if you want to think about it that way. And I think with poetry, you know, we used to read it a lot in high school, and now we don't. So, yeah.
No, narrative is nice, and I feel like that's why we kind of all stop reading poetry unless we're dedicated poets.
Yeah.
Kind of on a similar note to Ben, I don't have like a hate read I wanna really hone in on. I feel like I liked most of what I read this year, which is nice. I'm not complaining about that in the slightest. But honorable mentions, The Nine Cloud Dream is a book I read this year, which is a Korean novel influenced very heavily by Buddhism. So kind of a lot of the stuff we've been talking about very much kind of comes in there. I really had a wonderful time. I started reading the Elric of Melnimbene books by Michael Moorcock. I've really, really liked those. I think that he is someone who I really want to delve deeper into here in the future. He's asking a lot of questions. You know, he's really an author who asks, like, what can you do with fantasy? And he comes up with some very intriguing answers in a way kind of like John Ford from our last episode does. So he's someone I definitely want to delve a little deeper into. One thing I really want to do more of in 2024 is I really want to read more magazines, which is something that if you asked me like 10 years ago, I never would have believed I would have said. I have been a regular like New York Times Review of Books reader for the last year. And the more I kind of like delve into the world of magazines, like there's like I feel like I don't want to overstate it because like I don't really know like where things actually are. Like I feel like we're in a really interesting time. Like I feel like there are a lot of more people like trying to start magazines again.
Yeah.
And I really
like print culture.
Yeah, and I really love that. Like, I feel like that's kind of almost what we're trying to do in a way. Like, obviously on a like smaller, not a smaller scale, but like on a different scale.
Yeah.
Or like in a different format. Like when we were talking about starting the show, like we wanted to do this because we know that there are people out there like who want to have these conversations. We want to be part of those conversations.
Yeah.
And you know, starting a podcast is obviously easier than starting a magazine. Just because you need less people, frankly.
And less overhead.
And less overhead.
Yeah.
But, you know, I really want to read more magazines. I want to, like, try to pitch to some magazines that I like. But I think that, like, we're coming up to a really interesting time where the internet, in a weird way, it's facilitating a move towards like some forms of culture and away from others.
Yeah.
Like AI, the listener, I'm never, you will never hear me say AI without the biggest air quotes around
yeah,
it.
Language learning models.
Fuck that. Fuck it. It's going to be gone in like 2 years. But anyway, I actually think that the presence of that has made like people want like real stuff again for the first time in a long time. But yeah, I see people starting magazines. I see people writing for magazines like in a way that I did not before. I remember like, again, like 10, 15 years ago, like there were obviously magazines still around, but they felt so like desiccated and it felt like no one was reading them. They were just places for people with MFA degrees to like publish.
Yeah.
Basically for an audience exclusively of other MFA graduates looking to get published. And I feel like that's changing.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that like we're about to hit like a point where like, oh, people are making money writing for this stuff again, because that's obviously probably not the case. But cool, interesting people are starting and writing magazines, and I want to read more of them. Just kind of to give a couple like things that I've dabbled in and I want to read more of in the coming year, and I really recommend listeners do as well. New York Review of Architecture is super cool. As someone who like really wants to learn more about architecture, I found it to be really, really interesting and fun to read. Cleveland Review of Books is something they just put out, I believe, their first issue, like full issue, like in paper. Really awesome magazine. Everyone who I've looked at who writes for them, I think is cool as fuck. And I would really love to like have someone from that publication like on the show to talk about what they're doing and why they're doing it. Last of all, what was the last one I had? The Mekong Review is a really cool magazine. I believe they've been around a little bit longer, but they specifically focus on Asian literature. I found the work they're doing very, very cool. And that's obviously without even mentioning big boys. Like, I still think the New York Review of Books is absolutely worth your time. London Review of Books, I think, is frankly, the best literary publication in the world right now, and probably has been for quite a few years. Paris Review, I got the Paris Review t-shirt. I got the Paris Review shorts. I love the Paris Review.
John's got the Paris Review fit.
Yeah, absolutely. I do. I know they were started by the CIA. I don't care. Read the Paris Review. Hobart's is great. Yeah, read magazines.
I used to read a ton of Paris Review interviews before they paywalled them.
They have unpaywalled them.
Really?
I believe so.
Well, I'm back.
You're back.
It's so over.
Maybe I only have access because I bought the fit, but you'd also look good in the fit, Ben. It's a boxy t-shirt.
It's so over. We're back. Yeah.
I mean, that is the cycle of literature.
Right, yeah.
Well,
and I think listener, we're back period. So
yeah. I mean, again, not to keep harping on this stuff, but I do feel like we're reaching kind of a weird phase in culture, at least again in the Anglosphere, where it's like there's so much fake bullshit nonsense out there, whether it's AI or again just stuff people have been paid to write without caring about it. Like people can tell, whether or not it's I'm not gonna act like there's any money in this because there probably still isn't. But at the very least, there are people out there wanting to have these conversations. We're all looking for each other. Let's all reach out. Let's talk. We love you, listener. Well, why don't you tell us about your top 5 books? We'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, listener, what have you been reading?
Yeah. Oh, wait.
Oh, it's time.
Ben,
It's time.
They're playing the song.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2,
We'll get you next year, listener. Semper Books.
Semper Books.
All lang syne, my dear, for all lang syne. Let's have a cup of kindness here for all lang syne.
Thank you for listening to The Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir. You can support our show by supporting them. We hope you'll join us back in the stacks for the next episode soon. Semper Books, bookheads.